Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Ernest Hemingway, author of The Sun Also Rises and For Whom the Bell Tolls, versus F. Scott Fitzgerald, author of The Great Gatsby and This Side of Paradise. This is one of my favorite literary feuds because we have two writers who in some respects are very similar in their grandiose vision of what it means to be a writer. However, Hemingway's performance of this grandiosity is bolstered by his narcissistic tendencies, whereas Fitzgerald's was plagued with insecurity and anxiety. And depending on how you look at it, Ernest Hemingway either tried to save Fitzgerald from himself, or else he sought to destroy him. And if that's not enough to interest you, well, just stick around because Fitzgerald shows Hemingway his for reasons. The two meet in Paris in 1925. At this time, Fitzgerald is 29, and he had published This Side of Paradise 5 years prior, cementing him as kind of a star in the literary world. Hemingway is 26, and he's working on his first novel, The Sun Also Rises. Immediately, Fitzgerald finds himself in Hemingway's gravitational charm, and there's good reason for that. Fitzgerald was a romantic in the sense that he pined after a very specific sort of masculine grandeur. In his early short stories, you see Fitzgerald really romanticizing, for instance, the duties of soldiers. And chasing after this romantic lifestyle, Fitzgerald enlisted in the army but never saw the battlefield, whereas Hemingway was a decorated World War I veteran. So Hemingway would appear to the very insecure person of Fitzgerald to be everything Fitzgerald wanted to be, a masculine writer who is totally self-assured to the point of beleaguering arrogance and the utmost certainty of his own brilliance. Fitzgerald is so taken by Hemingway that he offers to help with The Sun Also Rises, which includes introducing Hemingway to Fitzgerald's editor, Max Perkins. In a letter to Max Perkins, Fitzgerald writes, quote, "Hemingway is very young and feels helpless so far away. You won't be able to help liking him. He's one of the nicest fellows I ever knew." Worth noting that very few people in Hemingway's orbit would describe him as helpless, much less nice. Since Fitzgerald made the introduction, he assumed a sort of editorial role with that novel, suggesting Hemingway cut the first two chapters of The Sun Also Rises, which Hemingway ultimately does. However, after the novel's published, Hemingway would come to resent Fitzgerald's advice, marking the beginning of a turbulent relationship. For what it's worth, though, Hemingway scholars pretty much unanimously agree that cutting those two chapters was not only the correct decision, but also helped to cement Hemingway's celebrated style. And I'd argue Hemingway knew that. His resentment was not so much for the advice he received, but that he felt he owed anybody credit for his success. In that same year, Fitzgerald publishes The Great Gatsby, which was a huge commercial failure. And the next year, The Sun Also Rises, with Fitzgerald's help, would put Hemingway on the literary map. This sent Fitzgerald into something of a tailspin that saw him drinking to excess nearly every day. Famously, it said that Fitzgerald would have 30 beers a day. Hemingway was also a heavy drinker, but he took great pride in maintaining a certain composure while doing so, whereas Fitzgerald, well, he got a bit more sloppy. Hemingway recounts an episode in Paris in 1929 during one of Fitzgerald's depressive drinking bouts, saying, quote, "Last time he was in Paris, he got us kicked out of one apartment and in trouble all the time. Insulted the landlord, peed on the front porch, tried to break down the door at 3, 4, and 5 a.m. I'm very fond of Scott, but I'll beat him up before I'll let him come and get us ousted from this place. As a matter of fact, I'm afraid I'd kill him." Then there's the matter of Zelda Fitzgerald, a brilliant artist in her own respect, and her marriage to F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of the literary world's most notorious unions. Theirs was a very fiery yet deeply troubling relationship that essentially saw the two tearing away at each other's psyche. As Fitzgerald put in a letter to Zelda, quote, "People say we destroy each other, but I never felt we destroyed each other. I felt we destroyed ourselves." Well, Hemingway definitely believed that Zelda was destroying F. Scott Fitzgerald, and especially destroying his promise as a writer. Hemingway wrote, quote, "I think Scott, in his strange mixed-up Irish Catholic monogamy, wrote for Zelda, and when he lost all hope in her and she destroyed his confidence in himself, he was through." What does Hemingway mean by confidence? Well, in his book A Movable Feast, Hemingway recounts a moment in a Parisian bathroom in which Fitzgerald asks Hemingway to take a look at his anatomy, stating, quote, "Zelda said that the way I was built, I could never make any woman happy, and that was what upset her originally. She said it was a matter of measurements. I've never felt the same since she said that, and I have to know truly." To which Hemingway assured him that he was, quote, "perfectly fine." Hemingway detested Zelda Fitzgerald for this and other offenses against Fitzgerald. Hemingway even took a shot at her in the initial publication of his short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, in which he writes of a, quote, poor F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose marriage to a wealthy woman destroys him. Fitzgerald wrote to Hemingway after the publication of that story, asking him to change the name, and in very typical passive Fitzgerald fashion, he writes, quote, it's a fine story, one of your best, even though the poor Scott Fitzgerald, etc., rather spoiled it for me. And saying, quote, when you incorporate it, the story, in a book, would you mind cutting my name? While Hemingway's star would continue to rise at a breakneck pace, Fitzgerald's would continue to fall at the same rate, inducing not simply jealousy, but a kind of pathetic envy. Fitzgerald wrote, quote, I talk with the authority of failure, Ernest with the authority of success. We could never sit across the table again. He is quite as nervously broken down as I am, but it manifests itself in different ways. His inclination is toward megalomania, and mine toward melancholy. After the publication of For Whom the Bell Tolls, F. Scott Fitzgerald writes to Hemingway congratulating him, saying, quote, I envy you like hell, and there is no irony in this. Hemingway had very little patience for Fitzgerald's self-deprecation, writing him, quote, forget your personal tragedy. We are all bitched from the start. But when you get the damned hurt, use it. Don't cheat with it. You see, Beau, you're not a tragic character. Neither am I. All we are is writers, and what we should do is write. Of all people on earth, you needed discipline in your work, and instead you marry someone who is jealous of your work, wants to compete with you, and ruins you. It's not as simple as that, and I thought Zelda was crazy the first time I met her, and you complicated it even more by being in love with her. And, of course, you're a rummy. But you're no more of a rummy than Joyce is, and most good writers are. You are twice as good now as you were at the time you think you were so marvelous. All you need to do is write truly and not care about what the fate of it is. After Fitzgerald's untimely death in 1940 at the age of 44, Hemingway wrote of his friend, quote, I never had any respect for him ever, except for his lovely, golden, wasted talent. If he would have had fewer pompous musings and a little sounder education, it would have been better maybe. But any time you got him all straightened out and taking his work seriously, Zelda would get jealous and knock him out of it. As hard as Hemingway was on Fitzgerald, he claims it was to motivate him to use his golden talent, writing, quote, I told him that for his actions in civil life as a criterion, he would probably have been reclassified or shot for cowardice. That was too rough, but it was always trying to get him to work and tell the truth, at least to himself. While Hemingway claims it was for motivation, his bullying of Fitzgerald only added to Fitzgerald's deep insecurity and depression, and his career would never recover, which prompts the question, was Hemingway this like Michael Jordan figure whose bullying of Fitzgerald truly meant to get him to tap into his deep potential, or was it Hemingway tearing down another competitor in the field of writing? Let me know what you think, and as always, who do you got in this one, Fitzgerald or Hemingway?